We hope. Welcome to another episode of Many Such Cases.
Many Such Cases is a podcast where we have conversations about the communities, cultures, and economies that are emerging on Farcaster. Yeah. So, Ted, let's kick it off. Tell us about your foot fetish and how much you love seeing feet.
No. I have a foot phobia. I hate toes. I hate feet. And now they're all over the motherfucking feet.
Okay, tell us what happened. How did we get here?
Catherine Keckers and I are friends. Also, side note, every time I text Keckers, I'm a big voice memo person for those who are in my close circle. Johnny knows this. They're just ripping voice memos. But every time I send Keckers a voice memo and I use her name, Siri always transcribes it as crackers. And I think it's so funny because, like, she's kind of a cracker.
That's
Anyways,
hilarious.
so I send her a message being like, what did you do? Like, what have you done? There are toe pics, there are feet pics all over my feed. I blame you. Like, what did you do? And in reality, she only ever casted once about it. So for those who are listening, you probably know this if you're on Farcaster. Keckers is our resident fitness, wellness, like body expert. She now works for a poop scanning company, knows everything that you could ever want to know about poop. And she also knows a lot about toe spacers. And so she posted something about how toe spacers pretty much fixed her back pain. And then I think it took on a life of its own. And so all of a sudden you started seeing in the feed that one person was buying toe spacers, another person was buying toe spacers, and they were posting photos of their feet with the toe spacers in it. Then more people were buying them. I saw an Amazon checkout page in Portuguese. So I was like, okay, this is going global. And all of a sudden, I go to her, I'm like, what is going on? I'm on a very casual run with somebody who checks Warpcast casually, not chronically online. He goes, hey, do you know what's going on in the feed? I opened up my app and it's like all foot fetish stuff. And I was like, what is going on? Anyways, turns out Keckers actually only ever made 2 casts about these toe spacers. One, the first one where she said it healed her back pain. And then the second one where she was like, here is the lore of the toe spacers. This is a hysterical because our last episode we talked about how things don't go viral. And I would say like this was a totally viral moment for Warpcast because not only were people posting tons of toe spacer content, then they made a toe spacer channel where everyone started posting in the toe spacer channel. And then someone, Club Ted member actually, went and decided, why don't we launch a toe token? And off the token goes. And so there's a lot of us who now got, free money if you ended up selling your toe token, and the toe meme continues to live on. So that, I am so icked out by it, you guys. I hate feet. I hate feet so much, but it's interesting. It was a very fun viral moment as you see it take on. And also she's here and I was like, what did you do? And she's like, no, it's not me. She's like, I didn't even get any toe token. She's like, I'm not even eligible for the toe token. She's just like, people keep tagging me in all of these feet pics.
I should send her mine. I should just airdrop her my toe tokens.
Yeah, I did. I sent her some of mine.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, here you go. She's like, no, I need to be pure. I'm like, no. I am dirtying this up. You've dirtied our whole feed. I'm dirtying your wallet.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it was funny because it came out of nowhere very quickly. Within like a few hours, everyone was sort of riffing off the joke. The channel blew up. The token happened by I think the end of the day. And then by the following day, people were like, wait, what? And then it's dead. Like,
I don't know. I don't think it's dead.
Oh, is it still going?
The token may be dead, but the trend lives on. I've had multiple people. Today I just posted, I said, I too have been influenced by Keckers, only because I went to Gold's Gym. And everyone was like, show us the toe spacers, thinking that I bought the toe spacers. I'm like, I did not. I'm not going to buy them. And if I do, I'm definitely not posting a photo of it. Like, get out of here.
I know. It's funny. It's like AeroNet 4, or is that what it is, right? Yeah, the AeroNet 4, the Kiwi. There's these Farcaster specific phenomenons that just come out of nowhere and everyone talks about them and then it becomes a meme and then it kind of just like fades. It becomes part of the lore.
Yeah, it's very fun though. The thing about them is that I will have the toe token for until however long. I could have it in
Yeah.
my wallet forever. This was a funny moment that I want to remember. I want to hold on to those. Oh, there was one other cultural moment that I wanted to talk about. Was
Okay.
last Friday. You
That's
guys
right.
know I made this meme called the Boomer Dads meme, and it was really just adding Johnny and Dan. Like, that was it. I was like, this
Pretty much
is
just
a
us.
meme that is just Johnny and Dan. Anyways, it's a Friday night at, I don't know, 7 p.m. Pacific. And by the way, I like super follow both of them, so I get notifications when they cast. All of a sudden, my phone is boom, 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 like buzzing. And I'm like, what's going on? And it's just a full out meme battle between both of you about shipping. Like, what should the quality of your initial ship be when you are a founder? It's a valuable insight that became a meme war in a good way.
Yeah.
But
I think calling what happened a war is a very generous representation of what happened to Dan. I think it was an absolute annihilation, total destruction. Yeah, I think that I just completely dominated in every single exchange. Anyone who has good taste will see that, but also the likes tell the real story. So you can see, I think I ratioed him like 2-1 probably. Anyway, how did this come up? I think Oxen made a cast about Daylight, and he said Daylight seems so amazing because it's like a well executed product, or at least it seems like it is. It's not been really out yet, so it's hard to say.
we're talking
And we
about
need to
Daylight. The Daylight is
the
the
computer.
that e-ink
Yeah,
tablet would actually be
that's
a
right.
more accurate description, not Daylight XYZ. Just so
That's
everyone
right.
knows.
That's right. And so I quoted him and basically said, I've done a 180 on this idea that if you're not embarrassed by the first thing that you've shipped, then you waited too long. I don't think people have the attention span, or they're not going to like extend their good graces to you. If you ship a turd, they're going to give you a second chance. They won't. They're going to just move on. And so I basically came out and said, make something great. And Dan reply guide and said, just ship it. Like, ship it and talk to customers. And so then I quoted him and basically brought up a series of examples that was like, build something great, shipped it, and talked to customers. And it was like an example of something that was actually really great, like the Tesla Roadster, and then some garbage fire kind of crappy product. And I just kept doing it, and we just kept quoting each other. And I think the argument kind of boils down to is that for me, it's speed, quality, scope, pick two. And for Dan, because in this particular instance, he's being more of a smooth brain, it's just speed or quality. Those are the only two things that you can choose. And so he's just saying, optimize for speed, sacrifice quality, ship early. And I'm like, okay, you're the infinite runway guy with probably like with the most elite network in the world. You have distribution, you have a huge Twitter audience. Like, most people are not in that situation. They can't ship a turd. They have to ship something really good in order for people to care. And so what I'm saying is add a third dimension, which is scope. So do something great. And if it means that it just is like really, really simple, it just does one thing well, that's fine. Just do that one thing, but do it better than everybody else. And then you can expand what your thing does. So those are the two different arguments. Do you look at the world through the lens of just speed and quality, or do you look at the world through speed, quality, and...
You know who's the scope guy?
Who? Who's that?
Varun. He's the one who's
Varun.
thinking about scope.
That's
right.
right. That's right.
He should have entered that conversation.
He wouldn't have needed to. I was representing his position, I think. Well, so
You guys, if you
Yeah.
missed this,
it was good.
you should definitely go back and look at it, because I feel on Twitter when founders are having this back and forth, it's meme spirited dunking. And maybe it's because I know both of you, but I was like, this actually feels very fun. Like, this feels like you guys arguing over a dinner table and everybody else just like giggling and laughing along with you. I don't know if that's how it felt for you.
It did. Yeah, because we were going back and forth in group chat as well. It wasn't mean-spirited. It was fun. It was
Yes.
all, yeah, it was teasing. So I think that's what kept it light. And also too, there was no like public hitting below the belt. There may have been a little bit of that privately, but because it didn't happen publicly, it's like all good faith, you know?
Yeah, as someone building, I found it to be highly valuable, not just from an entertainment perspective, but from an educational perspective. I was like, oh, I'm learning about different approaches and the pros and cons to each and why. So I appreciate
Good
it.
approaches, bad approaches.
No comment. No further comments. No further comments. All right. Should we dive into what's the latest and greatest on Farcaster?
Let's do it.
Okay. Awesome. So, Man of the Hour is actually Varun, who casted two important things this week. One was on frames, and one was on a new proposal for longer casts. And while Johnny and I could have done our own research, which we did, we actually thought it would have been a much better idea to just bring on the Man of the Hour, Varun, to explain these two things from his perspective. So, without further ado.
Varun, thank you so much for joining. Can you give us a quick TLDR on the longer cast FIP and why this matters to Merkle and the apps built on top of the protocol?
Sure. So the real TLDR is casts are now longer, 3 times longer to be more specific. The reason we're pushing for longer form content is, one, longer form content was always interesting, right? Like Twitter has managed to do it in a way that's brought a lot more content to the platform. So it's something we've always wanted to do. The reason we've been a little more methodical about when and how we rolled it out is making sure that the Farcaster network can actually scale with it. Because one of the things that longer messages do is increase the amount of data that hubs have to store. And for the last 4 months, we've been dealing with a lot of increased traffic as the network has grown. And so we wanted to make sure that we could do it in a way that would help the network scale. So now that we've laid the foundation for some of those fundamental things, hubs are working really well, data is streaming pretty efficiently, we're now able to do some of these things that increase data size on the network. And so that's where the longcast FIP came from. One additional piece of context for people who've been following along on some of the discussions is actually 2 versions of longcast that we've been talking about, which I think are different and worth separating. First one has been simply, I'm typing a message and I would like to type something longer. I'm usually composing it in Farcaster. I'd like people to get more context. This longcast FIP solves for that really, really well. There's a second piece, which is I write articles elsewhere, on Paragraph, on Mirror, on a bunch of other places, and I want that to come into Farcaster in a native way. That actually works through frames right now. Paragraph's frame does a pretty cool job of turning these into inline images, but the user experience isn't as nice as it could be. And so one of the FIPs that Vripan, DF, and others have been pushing for, which I think is really cool, is the ability to bring some of these articles into Farcaster in a more structured way so that you can actually read like a 10,000 character article or a 25,000 character article right within Farcaster if you've written it and published it elsewhere. So that's a second piece of longcast, which is still being worked on, which we're working through some details there before we get.
Would that work as a frame, or would that work as a cast?
I think this is a good question that segues into one of the other topics that y'all wanted to talk about, which is how are we thinking about frames? And so this is a very good example of one of the limitations of frames that's preventing a real interesting use case from taking off. And specifically, it is because the frame size is constrained. If you have a long article, you have this like tap through and read pages experience, which isn't particularly ideal. If you were to step back and think about what's ideal, right? The frames do 2 things that are really important. The first one is it brings it in line, so you don't have to think about leaving the app, you don't have to think about going anywhere else. The second is it has a subscribe button, so when you read an interesting article, you actually subscribe and you build a relationship with that person off Farcaster. The thing that we're trying to play around with is how can we actually import this content and make it readable? So can we bypass the need for this to be an image? Can we just have this be text and then load it nicely and actually change the size and container of the frame? But this requires some contextual information. So the idea is almost like frames plus plus, where it's like, okay, this is a type of frame that's an article. And so clients can actually think about a different way to render article-based frames that would make it much more native for people to read it versus the normal frame, which is like an image-based frame with buttons that you can interact with. So we're still early in figuring all this out. I think these are just ideas we have, but it seems like there are a bunch of applications that like kind of work within frames that would be a lot nicer with slightly better UI affordances. And we're trying to figure out the best way to implement them that would make them good for users, easy for developers, and also easy for clients to implement across the stack.
Got it. And as far as the long casts go, I think that's a nice breakdown of casts that you might want to be longer than 320 characters. And then there's like posts, which is kind of a categorically different thing, though they do share this commonality, which is they have a lot more characters. Is there anything that you would like to see people do, especially developers, with the longer cast format?
I think that the proximate first thing I'm most interested in seeing is there was a whole meta of screenshot essays back in the day on Farcaster that still persists. And I think that screenshot essays still create enough friction that some set of people are not expressing thoughts or ideas or interesting rebuttals, perspectives, whatnot, because it's just too annoying to write it. And so that's the thing I'm most excited to see is like, are we going to see an uptake in the number of interesting things being posted because people now have more fidelity to express themselves, which, by the way, is something we see people on Twitter doing a lot more now that Twitter has supported longer form posts as well.
Yeah.
I agree. I have a question on formatting. The common features of, a long form post is that it's got markdown formatting or some sort of WYSIWYG editor or something like that. As you think forward to either an iteration on the current FIP or an entirely new FIP, how are you thinking about formatting and like where in the stack that fits in? Like, is that part of the metadata payload? Is it a syntax thing?
It's a good question. This actually comes back to the kind of two separations of the different like longer types that we're thinking about, long casts versus external casts or article casts. So I think with long casts, the goal is to keep them as simple as possible, because the moment you start adding in markdown metadata, this A becomes a lot more complex to store on the network, but also B becomes harder for Warpcast, Supercast, etc. to render. And for most cases, people just want to express more text. I think 99% of use cases are just solved by this. When we get to article embeds or sort of these article posts, there I think markdown becomes a lot more important. And we have a lot more flexibility because we can say, hey, these articles are actually stored. There's a canonical location on the web where the article, the formatting, everything is stored, and clients simply pull it at render time and show it to users. So they don't have to store all of this data for all eternity. They just need to fetch it when needed and then render it. So we probably will see a lot more flexibility of what we support here. Whether it's full markdown or simple formatting of like headings in bold and bullet points, that's still TBD and being decided.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. In some ways, this is the way CSS works. There's just a formatting file that you reference, and then that tells you how to display the content.
One follow-up question, which is, as you were talking about frames, you're like, what would an article or a long form post look like in frame format? Does this also mean that you might be experimenting with other media, multimedia for frames? Are you exploring that as well?
So we're actually in a sort of exploratory period with frames. So we're reaching out to developers and asking them like what their biggest pain points are and collecting them. So if anyone watching this is trying to build on frames and has things that they haven't been able to build because of limitations, we would love to hear from you. Like, please DC me or tag me. We'd love to get the feedback. What we have learned so far, the things that have been most challenging for developers falls into a few buckets. One is there's a category of frames that are fine just being ephemeral, like they show up in your feed when you need to use them and they go away and that's okay. And there's a category of frames that are actually tools that you want to use consistently or periodically. These are things like polls, things like bounties, and things where you need to do things every so often. And having to go and discover a frame is actually really, really hard. So that's like one class of problems we want to discover is how do we make certain frames creatable when you need them. The second problem tends to come with limitations of like the surface. We see that in the article example, which is like, hey, a small box is not enough to read an article. So how do we actually expand that correctly in cases where it matters? Third pain point ends up being around payments, which is there are enough frames that want to do a simple send me $5 of USDC or send me 0.01 of ETH that actually is just too complicated in our current UI of like jumping through like n different hoops. And so for a set of cases where you simply want to charge a user money for something really basic, that should just be something that's really easy to trigger within the application. So it's almost like the Venmo type thing. This can be fulfilled by your wallet, but just very easy to kick off. Those are like three building blocks that people want that kind of work in frames, but don't really work super well that we're focused on. And then there's a bunch of like fundamental things around frames, like how do we make them faster? How do we make them more responsive? Which I think are like more obvious things that we need to go and improve, but are probably not sufficient that we just go and do that without working on some of these more important things. But Ted, I think your question probably is specifically around video/audio, if I had to guess.
Yeah. All of the above.
Yeah, I think we're still like looking into it. It's one of the ideas on our roadmap, but like we haven't run into a lot of developers saying yet, I'm trying to create an audio frame. This is what I wanted to build. It didn't work.
Yeah.
So like one of the smaller things we've been focused on and working with the Dracula team on is how do we make those video embeds work better? And it seems like that's actually the more interesting use case is like people are uploading videos and want it to work and less about I'm trying to get this into a frame. And so the former is what we are trying to make a little bit better. And I do think that video that we're working on is like embeds from other applications and Android video plays have not been particularly good recently. And so there's some issues to be fixed there.
Okay. Yeah. Next, would love YouTube links
And speed controls.
and speed controls. What are you going to introduce speed controls? You should ask Dan about speed controls.
Nice. What videos do you want speed control for in particular?
Loom videos. Like actually today, Wosh just posted a 3-minute video talking about some new Supercast features. And I typically will watch, I'm a slow talker. So anytime I hear myself, like clips of podcasts or something that I see shared, it's always like maximum cringe to hear myself talk at 1x. But it's kind of the same for other people. And like any video more than like 2 or 3 minutes, I like feel the instinct to bump it up to like 1.5x.
Yeah, Jesse did a video about like bass, like on-chain summer. Didn't watch it, too long. John from AutoMod did a video on how to do AutoMod features. Johnny did one. Didn't watch any of them because they were too long.
Okay, that's good feedback.
But I do love the videos. Okay.
Same.
Great.
Thanks for joining our little corner for 10 minutes. You're the best. All right, Johnny, now that we've gotten a quick little TLDR on the longer casts, do you have any questions, concerns, predictions for what we might see over the next couple of weeks? Varun's hoping to see more people using it as a form of self-expression. What do you think?
Yep. I really liked what he shared about thinking of this as two sort of different use cases. Like one is just like, I want to say more than, what I can in 320 characters versus like publishing, like long form publishing. The idea that there's a publishing protocol is super exciting to me. If that could be built or grafted on to Farcaster, I think that would be very, very cool. And if you imagine that you can say post something once and then you can read it in all these different places, I think that's cool. I'd love to talk to Colin and hear his thoughts on how this might be surfaced in Paragraph and Mirror. It's also something that we've actually thought about before with regard to displaying like creator updates in Hypersub. We maybe you have like updates that are, that are posted in Hypersub, but they're actually surfaced in Farcaster and they link back. So I think it's a really rich design space, particularly around the publishing use case. I think that to say, well, I just have a few more things to say, that to me feels less interesting. Like it's just like the show more interaction. You see this on Twitter. It's been around for a while. I think publishing could get super interesting. So I'm most excited about that.
So you're more excited about the proposal that's still being discussed?
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Interesting. I agree with that. I look at Barry Weiss. I look at a lot of independent journalists who are using Substack for that. And so I think that's more interesting from a news perspective, only because I know we've been saying this for a while, like where are the citizen journalists? And I just don't know if they can do what they want to be doing anywhere other than Substack right now. That's one thing. But on the longer casts, I am excited about this for a variety of reasons, because I agree with Varun. I think we'll see more people who can express longer form thoughts. When Twitter first came out with it, people were like, I'm not really sure, but I see it used quite often, especially from people who want to provide more in-depth analysis or critique or insights on a specific topic. And then for me, I know that a lot of times if I want to share a link, even some of the frames with longer URLs, I have to truncate a lot of the text or the content itself to keep it in one cast. And I hate that. So even though it's probably a marginal difference, I'm keen to see how people use it over the next few weeks.
I will say, just kind of counter argument, I guess devil's advocate here, is there have been so many times that I've wanted to cast something and I can't cast 100% of what I want to say because the character limit. So what ends up happening is I will take what I wrote and I'll just trim it down and trim it down and trim it down until it fits. And I think pretty much like 10 out of 10 times that results in a more simple, clarified message. So I think the character count really forces you to figure out, what are you trying to say? What's the most efficient way to say it? And I think it makes for like generally better content and better writing. I know for just speaking for myself, if you remove the character limit, I think the thinking and the writing could get like lazier. So that would be like my argument against having more characters being a good thing. It's good if the content stays good, but sometimes that can just lead to laziness. The other thing I'll say is my assumption is that anything that's behind the show more interaction, the drop off on views is probably, I would guess, is probably very, very big.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So for me personally, I'm going to continue to keep everything as brief as possible and keep it in the character limit. The one thing I actually don't like, and this could be a cool design space to explore at the client level, is the nice thing about the screenshot essay is that you get a thumbnail of what it is. So you can set your expectations clearly up front. So you can see like, oh, okay, this is very dense, or it's not very dense. It's only a few paragraphs. You can see that before you ever click on it. No surprises. Whereas with Show More, how many more characters are there? Is there like 5 more or like 5,000 more?
That's true. I will say I don't like screenshot essays for the most part because they're usually poorly formatted. And so if it's a trade-off between looking at a poorly formatted screenshot essay versus clicking view more and being like, this is way too much for me to read, I would actually rather the latter. But I hear you. I also think it's better for certain use cases that might be more conducive to channel content. Going back to your comment about like, oh, it leads to worse content, I would typically agree. But for instance, a good example would be like my older brother really wants to be doing like LA restaurant and pizza reviews, obsessed with pizza reviews. Usually you have to score several parts of pizza if you are him. He has multiple ranking systems. And he was like, I can't do all this in one cast. He was like, oh no, I'm going to have to make a thread. And then you get really discouraged when a good chunk of what you think is meaty content is in the follow-up cast that no one really pays attention to. But I agree with you. I actually do like having to make my stuff shorter because I'm pretty long-winded. So
yeah, me too. I mean, the other cool thing is like these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You could imagine a client like creating a screenshot essay from the text that you can then mint or something.
Yes.
Or like, there's cool stuff like that you can do. So yeah, I'm excited to see more of it.
I have thought a lot about being able to put something in and then output something else. Meaning like you just said, oh, you have a longer cast, make something where you can actually output that as a screenshot essay that you can mint it. I think we were talking about this in the Club Tit group chat where I was like, oh, that's like the ideal scenario is let's say you publish something on Paragraph, you can either choose to have it in frame or you can choose to have it as a screenshot essay that's mintable. That would be exciting, especially because I try and keep some of my Paragraph essays to be pretty short. Now we're going into like, let's just like veer from longer casts into frames because he was also chatting about some of that. Was that I'd love for there to be a frame where you can input text in and like maybe it is all of that. And on the back end, somehow pops out a mintable frame of like, okay, here's your screenshot essay. And you can just copy paste from an Apple Note into this input form and then it pops it out for you. Onto the protocol, you can choose however way you want it. But it's interesting. I don't think that there's that many frames that take a text input and gives you something as an output that is a more enhanced or more creative or like something interesting on the other end of the frame experience.
Yeah, I think that's right. An analogy, it's kind of a weird analogy to make, but what's interesting, say like with something like Amazon is you just like go to a website and you click a button to buy something. And then the second that you do that, there's like this huge supply chain that starts like moving because you click that button. Like some robot in some warehouse like starts moving across the floor and it gets a product and like all this stuff happens. Yeah. And I think what's powerful, so it's like this iceberg. You have like one very simple user interaction, which is, to click a button or a couple buttons, and then all this stuff starts happening. So it's this massive efficiency that you get. And I think frames are actually similar, where there's like all these steps to do something, to say buy a token or deploy a mint or whatever, like all kinds of stuff, both on and off chain, that if you can surface all of that into this little iceberg, like tip of the iceberg, which is the frame, and then you take a little bit of input from the user, but then you can do all kinds of stuff under the hood, I think that imbues the frame with a lot of value because it's efficient. You're saving time, you're saving steps. So I think the more that frames do that, the more valuable they become. So yeah, like if I could just paste a block of text and then it's like, oh, do you want to publish this as a post on Paragraph? Do you want to have this mintable? Do you want to share this in a group chat? Like, and you could just be like, click, click, click. Yes, do those things.
Yes.
And then that's all the frame does. And then you just got distribution in a bunch of places. You potentially are earning some revenue. You're getting exposure and interactions. If the frame can facilitate that, it's extremely valuable. So I think seeing more of that stuff baked into the compose experience, I think would be awesome, either in Warpcast or some other client. It's like time saving both for the creator and the consumer. And I think that starts to demonstrate some of the value of the frame.
Interesting. There's a lot of criticism. Frames aren't emote. Frames aren't meant to be emote. They're supposed to be a tool in a full toolkit that someone can use. But I think we both have been somewhat disappointed in the variety or the content, or I think we're both yearning to see more types of frames, or let's say like better use cases. I asked you, I was like, why aren't there better frames? And you were kind of like, well, think about it. It's effort versus ephemerality. And so can you share that?
Yeah, just the fact that frames are inherently ephemeral. Like they exist in this feed and they come and go. And so I think there's a sort of inverse relationship to the effort. Like, why would you put an enormous amount of effort into something that has no persistence? You'll cast it to your audience and some number of people will see it and that may interact with it, and then it's gone. They forget about it. They never see it. Thinking about it from a developer's perspective, it's like, I think you would want to match the effort to the opportunity. If the opportunity is ephemeral and it's scarce, then I think the level of effort that you want to put in should probably be similar. And so I think early on, we saw these insane frames where there were like these really rich games that people could play and all kinds of stuff that you could do. And then I think as people started realizing like, oh, they're kind of come and go, you can't really find them, they're like, okay, this is probably not the best use of this primitive. So yeah, I think for as long as they remain ephemeral, the amount of effort that developers are willing to put in is, I think, going to continue to be like relatively low. I think it'll be for these more utility things like signing up. Like I saw one the other day that I was like, oh, this is perfect. Chris Corella shared it. And it was just like, tap a button to enter a raffle. And like, that was it. It just got your FID and it was super simple. It saved me the steps from having to like open a tab and go figure out how to use some new site and enter my email or whatever. Like it was like one tap, I'm in, it got my FID, I'm done. So I think things like that right now, because they're so ephemeral, is what we're like most likely going to see until there's a kind of app store like experience that's curated or even algorithmically driven where you can browse and search and sort and filter frames. I just don't think that people are going to be doing much with them other than to drive the primary CTAs on there.
That's true. Even with Bounty Caster, though, as Vern referenced, he's like, this is a utility. A lot of the Bounty Caster frames are utility driven, yet even those would be much more valuable if they were less ephemeral. And
yep,
I agree. Sometimes I get tagged still to this day of someone asks who created the frame with the audio content that felt like a video. And still I'm getting tagged in things. It's now June and that came out in February. So it's interesting to be like, wow, people remember them, but have no way of going back and finding them.
exactly.
I think that's an issue. I think DGen did a great job of showing us that like, okay, if you can just pin a frame to the top of a channel to find out your DGen allocation, how high value that is. But I almost think that there should be a bookmarked frame. I guess you can bookmark them.
But
I don't
then
know.
you still have the same issue because now you have a list. Like bookmarks for me are basically useless because once you've bookmarked 20 or 30 things, you only see the top 5 or 10. So you need to be able to create lists. Like it gets complicated. So I think some kind of frame discovery experience is likely to lead to more and better frames.
I'll just say, like, as a non-technical person, I used a frame for announcing Summer at Club 10, right? I used Naynar's no-code studio. I uploaded a bunch of things, previewed it, posted it, worked great. Had a mint at the end, could customize that. But I was thinking about it and I was like, oh, this is pretty easy. Why aren't more people doing it? It's like, okay, well, you need to have a Naynar account to do this. You need to go to a web page in order to do this. You need to leave Warp entirely and test it. And I don't know how many no-code studios there are. They're all quite hard for me to find. I think if they just made it a lot easier for people to create custom frames, the same way on Instagram, when you make an Instagram story, there's so many different things that you can do within the app. Like if you think about all of the best content creation apps today, a lot of the content editing or the content customization happens in the app itself. And I don't know how we can start using frames more unless there's some sort of frame creation or like template of like, okay, here's a couple of different things that you as a user, a non-technical user, can do to create a frame without having to leave Warpcast at all.
And it's a good point. I think that the creation experience being baked into Warpcast is really important, but it also brings up the question of why make that a frame? Like, for example, if you want to create a story, let's say, or an image or a video or a mint or whatever, like why you could imagine a rich compose experience, kind of like what you see in TikTok or Instagram, where you can add stickers and you can edit stuff and you can add layers. There's like this really rich content creation experience that you have. Why does any of that need to be a frame, say within Warpcast? Like for me, when I think frame, I think bringing in external things into the feed. That's the real power of it. Like, for example, with Hypersub or Paragraph or many other things, it's like, oh, you can complete actions on other sites directly from the feed. Slice is a good example. I saw one today. There was this higher shirt. It's like degenerate optimist or something, or like
I got that one. That's the one I got too. Delusional, I think. Or
delusional
yeah.
optimist. Because I always make a joke about how we're just, like, founders are just degenerate. Like all these steps that I would have otherwise had to complete on some third-party site, I can just give an input, which is quantity, 1, size, and then it goes, oh, well, you have your connected address. You just complete the transaction and you're done. So it brings in all this third-party stuff. That's the value of the frame, is that you basically get third-party functionality in a first-party experience. If you think about that from content, most of what you're doing when you're creating content in a product is you're taking the content from your device and you're just like putting it onto the app. So you don't need to reference any third-party thing.
So I hear what you're saying, and I think the examples that you just shared are very utilitarian. I'm thinking about it from a pure entertainment perspective, in which I do think content creation can be more dynamic, more engaging, more multidimensional if you allow people to do frames. And you see this with polls. Like there's Instagram polls. Another example is that this is on Instagram or on TikTok is, it'll give you a prompt and you input something and then you share it and then someone else clicks on that sticker and then they input it and share it to their own thing. And it creates like these viral movements. And so, for instance, an example that I can think about is a week ago, or maybe it was longer, I said, here are fun facts about me. And it was like my favorite song, my favorite food, my favorite season. But if that could have just been within the app, here's the template that I'm making. I'm casting this. Out pops a photo, like a JPEG or whatever, a frame with my answers on it. And then somebody else clicks do my own. Then that is like new content creation. And to me, that's exciting. It's a social experience. People feel like they're sharing more about themselves. And that isn't available right now for me to make within the app. So I just had to do it as text. And you're like, oh yeah, that, like, I don't need that as a frame, but I think it's more fun as a frame instead of somebody like copying my text, pasting it into a cast, deleting my text, writing their own answers, and then casting it. It's like, oh, no, let me just like insert my answers into a frame. The frame will generate the photo based on my answers, and then it becomes shareable content from anyone. It can be like, share to this, share to that, etc. And that to me is actually like exciting from an entertainment perspective, not from a utilitarian perspective or like utility perspective. That's just like me coming in it from a very social experience, is seeing what movements, what trends, what moments or experiences do people latch onto in normal Web 2 social media that drives community or connection. And those are examples that I could see being valuable.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the idea, it's like remixing content. So if I'm understanding what you're saying, basically it's that the reason why you should contextualize content in a frame is so that it can be remixed more easily.
Yeah. High quality or interesting content is hard to come by on Farcaster right now. Okay, so let's say you take a high quality content creator and they say, here's a template and use this template, and you make any inputs marginally or significantly more interesting by putting it through this frame. You can see this with Instagram and photos, right? So you have all these photo editing apps that are just templates and you're remixing existing content into something that is aesthetically more pleasing or aesthetically more engaging. And I think there's value in that. That is a stretch, but I do think that it's highly valuable and can improve the output of content. That being said, the most imitated or copied frames have been really low quality content so far. And I think that's where my frustration comes from.
Yeah, there's interesting ideas here. Let me push back a little bit. So right now on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, there's like all these social platforms to make it super easy to remix other people's content and to make new content, but they don't use frames. I'm pushing back on this idea that you need a frame to make content more easily remixable. I really like the idea of what you're saying, which is you created some new trend or say content, a piece of canonical content, which is here's more about me. This is my favorite music. This is my favorite food, blah, blah, blah. Right. And then you're saying, you tell me, like you go and you remix this. Right. And so let's say that you want to kick that off. And so the challenge here is like, okay, I might see that and go, oh, I want to share this too. But now I got to it's like a pain in the ass. It's hard to do that. And so what you want is just like how you have on Instagram or YouTube, where you can like click one button, like one click, and then like, boom, you get this like template to where you just like answer the things and it's done.
Correct.
Okay, so I would say like that already exists on other sites and they don't use frames. I don't think that you need a frame to do what you just described.
You don't need a frame, but there's a couple of reasons why I do think a frame is more interesting, and I'll give you an example. Do you remember the Roastcaster? Do you remember Roastcaster?
Yes.
So Roastcaster is the most interesting because it is remixing content. So it basically had, I think it was like 6 different archetypes. You didn't know that. You would just see somebody else's archetype and you'd be like, oh, this is interesting. I want to get roasted. You'd click roast. It would then go and look at a ton of kind of, let's say, all the on-chain data about how you work with meme coins and how you work with NFTs and your Farcaster OG NFT. And then it would give you an output that was personalized. And people loved it. And I would consider that a like remixed content with on-chain, or you could even say like off-chain data, like from hubs incorporated into it. And that's where it starts getting way more interesting to me, is that you can actually do content remixes with data that you can get from those third parties that you were referencing. That is more so interesting to me. Or like, oh, let's look at your slut. And then like it's shareable content that is viral and social in nature. That's, yeah. But you're right. It's good pushback. It might not need to be a frame, but I think it is more interesting as a frame. And also then other clients can incorporate it. If Warpcast does it within its own thing, it lives and dies in Warpcast.
Yeah, I have a lot to say. And I think riffing on this idea, like we agree that the power of a frame is to bring in to Farcaster some external source of data.
So I think that's one powerful feature of it, but I don't think that's the only function of it.
I'll take the view that it is. I agree. I think I agree with you. Just for argument's sake, I'll be a maxi and say that the value of the frame, actually the only value of the frame, is that it can take in data that's not on Farcaster and it can bring it into Farcaster with very, very minimal user interaction. Like that is the core value proposition of the frame. And so, it's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking about the roast frame. And what's interesting about it is that it's like almost like synthetic content. Like it created new content from existing things, like things that exist outside of Farcaster. So for example, it looked at, did you get this coin? If so, did you sell it? If so, when? Okay, we're going to use those 3 pieces of information to generate some new piece of content. Another thing that was going around recently was, this is what your FID is worth. And so that's like a new piece of content that I can share that I didn't have to make. And I got it for free just by virtue of the fact that I'm using Farcaster, right? So one idea that I had kind of as you were talking was like, what if you could just add more sources of data to almost like a frame registry, or maybe you could just do this in the form of attestation, so it was all on chain. But one simple example of this is that whenever I go through a Slice checkout, I've already put in my shipping address. So that's data that Slice has that I don't have to put in again. And so, like, if you could imagine other systems making use of that, of course, I would give them the permission to do so. Like, that'd be interesting. So, for example, what if I could connect my Spotify account to Farcaster? And then what if I said anyone who wants to make a frame can use my Spotify data? Or so an example of that would be like Spotify does this at the end of every year, and it goes viral. It's gone viral the last couple years, which is
Spotify Wrapped.
Exactly, Spotify Wrapped. Like, that's synthetic content. I didn't have to make it myself. It emerges from my use of the product. And so I imagine, like, one idea that I had as you were talking, which would be cool, would be a frame that generated 2 truths and a lie. Just from my on-chain history. Like, so I don't have to manually create anything. All I have to do is just like copy the frame link, I paste it in a cast, boom, I just got this new piece of content that's specific to me. You could do the same that's specific to you because it's pulling in all this data from an external source.
Yes. To be honest, I just don't think that there's that many interesting on-chain data points right now to pop out something interesting. It takes somebody who's very creative to be creating something like Postcaster. And I don't know if we're there yet. Like, another frame that I think takes all this, let's say, hub data is here's your circle of friends, the Farcaster circle of friends, which for some reason I'm like blacked out in all of them. Like, if you just see a black PFP, it's me. I was like,
Oh my
what
God.
I'm like, I looked
That's
at
so
all
funny.
of it because I was like, all of our friends did it. And I was like, how am I not in your inner circle? I was like, what the fuck? All of a sudden I do my own and I'm like, but who's the black PFP circle? And all of a sudden I do my own and it's me. Like, why am I being censored? Anyways, that was another interesting one. I could also see, like, there's so much rich hub data too. It's like, the BuzzFeed quizzes, like that, like making a quiz and then like being able to store those, like, oh, here are all of your answers over time. And then it's a project says, oh, here's how you answered all these like fun and funky questions. Like, here are the different brands, or here's the hyper subs that you'd be interested in. Or, oh, here are different channels that like you might not have discovered yet. So I do think frames, yes, it's capturing data from third parties, but I do think that there's also value in pretty much like pushing data to the third parties as well in a way that incorporates content.
Yeah.
I would love to have a frame hackathon that focuses on synthetic content or content remixing, as you said, especially as a social network, because I think it drives community, but there's not enough community or not enough vibe, scene, culture stuff on chain yet for it to be like that actually interesting to me. Like, otherwise it's just not that interesting. The use cases are too narrow.
I'm reminded of the C Club like meme generator thing that they did this past week, and like how you could just auto generate those.
And it's also could have been in a frame.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, it would be a frame, and
this should have been a frame. Like, I honestly was like, damn, this should have just been a frame.
But you can imagine like all these component pieces. It's almost like a Figma file or something where you have like 20 different components and they can be mixed and matched in all these different ways. And then you just do the mapping between like, okay, if they've bought this, or if they've sold that, or if they hold this, or if they've minted this, like that would then determine like the kind of persona that you create, like the meme persona.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that would be fun, but you're right. You need a rich source of data for those to be delightful and like true and surprising. And that's hard. So probably you need a combination of both on and off chain data, and probably manual input from the end user, but also you can just infer things from what they've done. So, but again, this brings us back though. It's like this could all be built. Well, but no, this could all be built, but like, why would someone put in all the effort to do it if it's here today, gone tomorrow, and you can't get back to it, right?
Yeah. That's why I think I would do this. Like, as a product studio, we have people enter their inputs in terms of like ephemeral content, like the favorite food, all of these answers, like that's an off-chain data collection. I'm gathering specifics. Then you can pair it with their on-chain data. And then I can create this meme that's like, oh, you've answered all 10 of these questions before. Click here, generate like which farcaster figure of like these new memes that I'm making that actually is the best match for you. That's an easy way to do it. And I think you can do data collect. Like, isn't that what Ponder's doing in some ways? Like data collection through frames. I don't know. My brain can't function on frames anymore, though.
Yeah, okay,
I'm like,
time to move on. Time to move
I've
on.
hit my limit on frames. No more.
It's Friday. It's afternoon. It's been a long
Okay.
week. I think we should wrap it up.
I think we should wrap it up too, but I do think that there's one more thing, conversation that we've been having in messages right now about high quality content. And that
Yes.
relates back to the conversation that we just had is
Yes.
what is high quality content and how do you actually get more of it on the platform? And then the other thing is the power badge conversation. People who have power badges should only be posting high quality content, but it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg because if you don't have your content seen, then you're not really incentivized to continue posting high quality content.
Let me say a few things on this so we can kind of get into it now. So I will say that one man's trash is another man's treasure. Like, that's cliche because it's true. And I think it's especially true in content. So what I like looking at are memes. Most
I like
people,
memes too. Everyone
I
likes
like memes, right?
Who
I look at
doesn't
a lot
like
of
a
memes.
meme?
I agree. Now, there's lots of people out there that if they saw what I see would be like, this is a complete garbage fire. Like, do not show this to me. I don't want it. I take a little bit of an issue with being like, oh, this is not high quality content. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. If you think about marketplaces as like willing buyers and willing sellers, right? I don't know what they're buying and selling. To me personally, it may not meet my tastes and preferences, but like a thriving market is matching buyers and sellers. And if you think about a social network as being like buyers and sellers of attention, someone's producing some content, someone's consuming content. Who am I or who is anyone to say that, oh, well, that's low quality? It's like, what do you mean it's low quality? Like, it may not be for you, but if someone is engaging with it, then clearly that's a sign that there's demand. So like the job of the network is to match supply and demand.
Okay, guys, for a little bit more context, is that there was a conversation that some, let's say, like some users were complaining that they weren't getting distribution, etc. They don't have power badges. And the response that I gave was like, well, it's low quality content. And Johnny's saying like, no. Like a lot of people, like this is what some people want. And like, that's what the job of the network is. And I agree with that. The job of the network is to make sure that people who like that content are connected to that content. It is no one's fault then that the total addressable market for that content is small. And I do not think that the complaint can then be, oh, my content isn't being seen, or like, oh, I'm not getting distribution, when the job of the network is to connect people the content producers with the people who want the content. And it just so happens to be that the slice of that pie is quite small. Like they could be fully concentrated to everyone on the network who cares about that content.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the challenge then becomes to how do you communicate that so that the person knows? So they go, okay, I'm pretty confident that anyone who's interested in what I have to offer is at least getting it. And that the people who are not engaging with me are not interested, right?
That's a good point. You're like, okay, how can you tell them that they've maxed concentration or they've maxed distribution for anyone who gives a F? Yeah.
Yeah, so the analogy would be that I've set up my stall at the market and I've been here all day, and I'm pretty confident that the vast majority of the people that have come to the market have seen what I have to sell and have chosen not to buy. Like, now the complaint, I think, and to take the analogy further, is that people feel like they're kind of like behind the loading dock, like at the end of the parking lot, and they actually don't have any visibility at all, that people are going to the market and that they're just not seeing anything. And so it's like, wait a minute, I do have something to offer. I do have, value here, But because I'm not at the center of the marketplace, no one's seeing it. And so you're saying that no one's seeing it because it's not valuable, but I'm saying that like I'm not able to demonstrate the value because no one's able to see it. My claim, what I think is happening on the network right now today, is that there are people who are doing interesting, valuable things, and that they're not getting exposure to folks who want to consume that content.
I 100% agree with that. I totally agree with you that there's interesting content that's not being surfaced. I think it can easily get confused is trying to solve the problem for those that are the loudest, and not for where I think we should be solving the problem is for those who posted interesting content and who then left and who aren't speaking. But like that's not how a social network works. Like a social media platform literally is like surfacing the people who are like noisy about this and who are making a big deal about it, when in fact like that's probably a very small portion, and the number of people who've churned who might have posted interesting content and then didn't get engagement and are just gone is actually much more valuable in solving that problem than the squeaky wheels.
I totally agree. And I think if you're like the organizer of the marketplace and you're looking and you're like, oh shit, there's some people who have some stuff that I don't personally like. I think it's kind of, chintzy, kitschy, whatever. It's not for me. I'm not going to buy it. And they're very loud. And I personally may think that even if I put them at the epicenter of the marketplace, they're not going to sell much because I don't think what they have to sell is that valuable. But them and the people that are actually selling that I personally find really valuable and really compelling, who are also situated in the back, they just left. They didn't say anything. They just got up and were like, nope, I'm not getting the kind of sales that I would expect here. I'm gone.
Exactly.
Both of those people represent the exact same problem to you, the organizer of that event, which is that you have a problem matching buyers and sellers. And so, yes, there's a spectrum of what is in the quality of what is being sold. And that, that's debatable. That's very personal preference based. But fundamentally, you're not doing your job, which is that you're not matching buyers and sellers.
Okay, I agree with that. But if you're building a social network, it's actually incredibly important, like at this stage, for you to surface the content that is interesting to the largest proportion of people.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. I think we actually just agree on a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like you have to look at the market of buyers and be like, what are they interested in? And you want to favor the kinds of content or whatever, goods and services that they're going to find most compelling. I think that's right. Okay. I've actually been thinking a lot about this from the perspective of memes, which is it's very difficult to figure out what do people like, because the likes are easily farmed. So like one thing I'd love to see is what is the percentage of power badge, like take a given cast and look at the total number of likes, and then you ask the question, what percentage of these likes are from power badge holders, assuming that power badge is a proxy for a real authentic person, like human being. Like what percentage of those have liked this thing, and using that as a kind of proxy for should we have more of this thing is what I'm trying to get to. And a lot of times there'll be casts where I'm like, this is I think this is a horrible meme. It's not funny. I don't find it interesting, but it gets a lot of likes. And so I'm like, okay, who's wrong here? Like, am I wrong in that I should be like promoting more of this, or are they wrong in that this is actually low quality and I should get rid of it? And you're trying to figure out what are you using as signals to answer that question. Is it likes? Is it replies from other people? Like, it's difficult. It's very difficult to answer.
I was talking about this with someone before who said I was looking at the content on Workcast and it was really tough for me to figure out like what performs well, because some of the stuff that has a lot of likes doesn't make any sense. I've noticed if I post at the hours of 9 p.m. to midnight or later, I get the most likes. And it's because of who is awake at those hours and who can see the content over the course. And I've known this. I've looked at all of the likes. I'm like, okay, this is wild. I think it's an important touch point. And I know that I've recently been chatting with a ton of teams who are building like analytics tools for you to get a better sense of this. And this is something that I've said is I care who likes my content. Like not every user is equal. And that's really important to me.
We got to wrap this up.
We got to wrap this because it's the weekend. Okay, bye.